Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for being here today. I'm assuming that by being here, you have an interest in being part of a better system for extension. And based on the range of people here from all over Australia and every different industry, this interest is probably going to be pretty varied. It could be just having something better for your farming clients, more relevant research, learn from other sectors, learn from what others are doing, getting someone to take notice of your issues, or thinking there's a business opportunity to be had. And I'm sure I do speak for the stakeholders of the project that all these interests are valid and welcome and speak to the heart of the topic and the issues for discussion today. So my presentation this morning is just to highlight some findings from the research to date of 1,800 farmers and advisors who participated in those face-to-face forums and responded to surveys about their needs, the issues and challenges they face when it comes to the extension system. Now, the main findings relate to today's forum, are presented in the discussion paper, but I'm just focusing on a couple to stimulate and contribute to the discussion for the forum today. So what I'm going to do is just provide a little bit of background and a little bit about the research approach. I'm not going to labour that, and just some of the terminology so we can sort of tap into some of the results and what they mean. I'm just going to focus on sort of three key areas around the nature of farmer demand for information, advice and support, some of the barriers that are around private sector engagement, and who needs to do something? You know, is it a policy issue, is it an industry issue, is it a personal or individual issue? And then propose some opportunities. So actually let me start with the conclusion. Let's get it out of the way, let's put it out there, and then I'm going to talk about how we come to that. So in terms of the title of the project, in terms of the title of my talk, stimulating private sector, increasing returns from R&D, farmers adopting, benefiting from R&D, then it's clear from the results to date that some opportunities need to be grasped. And I can say that probably over many years of this issue being discussed and debated, that perhaps what hasn't been done is the grasping of the opportunities. Some of the opportunities will probably be quite familiar to you. Now, perhaps why some of those opportunities haven't been grasped to date is that it appears that it really does require new ways of doing things. It's going to cost money, and it needs to actually engage with some of the problems and issues that will be discussed. And it's also going to involve what economists call transaction costs, just because of the diversity of providers and systems in each industry, in each sector. So I suppose the key question then, is it worth it? Is this effort going to be worth it? But I think when we look at the total value of the RD&E investment of about $1.5 billion, I know there's arguments about that, then if you just think, hang on, if there's a 1% improvement, we see that 1% improvement, that's a pretty huge return. So we have to think today, is this all too hard, or how's it best done? And that's why I'm quite excited to be listening and hearing to the discussion and from our panellists, etc. So some of these things are listed here as where I'm going to be heading with the conclusion, but I just want to go through, well, how did we get to this point? So just a little bit of background about where I'm coming from in terms of presenting some of the results. Today it is at the national level. We're all here probably from our own region, our own state or our own industry, but I'm just presenting some of the data more at this national picture. There is state level data, there is industry specific data. It is specifically about the private sector and their practice and engagement or involvement in the RD&E system, particularly extension. Now, as advisors and farmers have said to us at our forums, so I do appreciate that the farmer and advisor relationship exists outside of R&D. Farmers make decisions for all sorts of reasons that might not include R&D, but we're trying to sort of focus on this particular aspect. Extension also fulfills many functions, but today, and for this particular aspect of the research, we're looking at advisory and extension services. And so it is encompassing the day-to-day or regular service contacts of people working direct with farmers as a potential avenue for knowledge exchange related to R&D. So in that regard, we're really focusing on this intersect between R&D, farmers and the private sector. So in terms of the research approach, we're wanting to build on previous work, and I do acknowledge a lot of the work that's been done by some people in this room across Australia and internationally. We need to have a conceptual framework, which was sort of quite a struggle for the analysis of a lot of the work that we've done. And so what we tried to do is focus on, well, if the issue is grasping opportunities, we've got to be thinking about who can do something. So really about who can take action. So when we thought about that often this issue is thought about as, well, is there market failure or not? So we need to consider that often economists and government do look to, well, where is the evidence around market failure? So we had some of that in our mind. Often industry and government as well look more into what might be a perverse outcome or something that's not going very well, and so they might be looking at risks of privatisation. So we needed to be cognizant of that. But I suppose from our research perspective, as social scientists, we were also particularly interested in the individuals and their actions and their interactions. So the social glue, the networks of trust, ties between public and private sector, and what was happening on farm. And so for us, the Agricultural Innovation Systems Framework provided a way to look at things like governance, like coordination and collaboration. So our framework's there. We also knew that part of grasping opportunities requires a national view and strong evidence base for good policy. And so in that sense, we tried to target a nationally significant data set in the surveys. And also for it to be important to acknowledge the voices and lived experiences of farmers and advisors. So our research approach has tried to tackle these things. So to come to just some of the data set and the data I'll be talking about today, the survey that Ian introduced was picking up from what came out of the forums, the face-to-face meetings, focus groups with farmers and advisors, using other data sets that we had to formulate a survey for Australia's farmers and advisors. And using the networks of the stakeholders, as well as some random methods, using a stratified sampling technique around industry, state and age. We have a sample of 1,000 farmer responses and 655 advisor responses. Now, when we talked, so the advisor survey was split, so we had, a business owner could respond to the survey on behalf of their organisation, or an advisor themselves, from public or private, could speak from their individual perspective. So even from that sense, when we look at just that part of the sample, we asked people on average how many farmers did they work with. That totalled to about 40,000 farms across that sample. We know that not every there might be multiple farms there. So based on the average of 4 advisors potentially having an intersect with a farm, we could well have covered between 10,000 and 40,000 farms through the advisory side. So we had responses from farmers about their use of information, advice and support, their connection with research, their views on extension in the private sector. From advisors, it was about really who they are and their organisation, what sort of work that they did, and what sort of interaction they desired in the RD&E system. So just in terms of some definitions that we've used that will help in some of what I'll talk about, we did use, instead of using the word extension, we did explain, we're talking about the information, advice and support that you receive in your farming. We did ask farmers about who they used, and this from an organisation perspective, but we asked them to identify their main source. And so today when I talk about main source, it's that response that farmers made and whether they were a public, private or industry organisation. Farm size, when it's a cross-sectoral project, is always very interesting. We have used the ABS data set, but we used a cross-connect between income and hectares, but with income being the main one I'm talking about today. And larger farms, everyone have a different perception of what a larger farm is today. We're just looking at that as being over $1 million of gross farm income. And the sector, as I said, I'm not presenting a lot of sectoral information today, but farmers and advisors nominated the enterprise or the sector which they most commonly worked. So just in terms of a typology that we've used for identifying main source and the type of advice, we use the goal, I suppose, of the organisation of the extension system. So we do have government, but that can be sort of federal, state or catchment level. We have research and development corporations or industry. We have product resellers or farm input suppliers. We have independent fee-for-service advisors. We have processing companies with some farmers getting their advice from who they provide their product to, and an other category. So that has worked across both the farm and the advisor results. So I just want to move to the three areas of findings to stimulate some of the discussion today. And the first one is around the farmer demand for private sector advisory services. And with the help of the group, try to think what might be the questions that the private sector might be asking. And so about, can I expand my business? Is there, do I need to do anything different? Or, what's the engagement in extension? So first of all, thinking about demand in general, I've always, through my career, seen farmers as very self-sufficient, self-reliant when it comes to skills, knowledge and information in farming. And, that's absolutely come through in the data, except we did find that a fair proportion, which is over half, say they didn't currently have the skills and knowledge required. And 60% said we don't always know where to go for the information and advice we need. And 63% were unsure or didn't think they could further lower their cost of production, just as a proxy around farming. Now, although this differs by industry, and so we do have some of that data, many of us here today are in the service and knowledge game. So you would say that we have an issue here, that things aren't clear enough and things could be better. And so there is a demand around skills, knowledge, information and services. And I think this is an area of uncertainty that farmers are calling us to do better in. Then there's another aspect of demand, and that's the extent to which farmers are currently relying on different sources of information and advice. And what we see here is that the private sector are already very important. Again, in some sectors more than others, but here all sources are used. So at the top we have the product resellers and farm input suppliers, with 85% of farmers saying this as an information source. Research and development corporations are the next one, 72%. Farmer-owned information advice and support organisations, such as the farming systems groups, 69%, government 64%, independent fee-for-service advisors, I'm reading there, 63%, and the processing companies 53%. So all sources are used. And when then farmers are asked, well, what about a main source? Is there one that you do rely on or say that you would rely on more? And that's the colours in blue. So you can see that all private sector and still public sector are a main source for certain types of farmers. So it could be a private sector person, it could be government, it could be an RDC. Independent fee-for-service advisors were important here. So 32% of farmers nominated this as an important main source. Now, this did differ based on a few factors, but one of the ones that I thought was quite interesting was around farm size. So the blue arrows really is sort of the trend as farm size increased, and we have it broken down for more of the income categories. But we can see that use of government declined with farm size, research and development corporations was independent of farm size, product resellers, it was a slight decline in farm size, farmer-owned groups, about the same, but independent fee-for-service advisors, that's where there was an increase in use with farm size. So for policy or industry groups trying to engage or see change amongst different types of farms, for instance, then there's a way to think about or strategise around engagement. But I think an important aspect of demand is, well, we know that, many of you will say, well, this is no surprise, we've known this for a long time. But I suppose the issue is whether farmers are changing and adopting as a result of this advice from these sources. You might think, oh, is there a right kind of change? Do we support change in a better way, or does one group do that better than another? Well, what we've done is there were 970 open answers of farmers to the question, using this main source, have you made changes in your farm operations, business or practices as a result of working with your main source? And I just wanted to show you some of this. Obviously, there's limitations with the data around, well, we don't know if it's the right kind of change, if there is a definition of that. But what it really shows is that there's no monopoly on change. As I said, nearly every farmer responding to the survey talked about things that they had changed, things they'd adopted, things that they'd done as a result of this interaction. And so of those verbatim responses, they could type it or if it was on the phone, most made changes we've themed them up around farm practices, changes to inputs and products, changes to the farm business, and changes to infrastructure, machinery and equipment. And if we just pull out the farm practice examples, so lots of areas of change. I just pulled out the fertiliser, or we just pulled out the fertiliser program one, and we took out, so this is using a particular technique of looking at frequency of words and clusters of words. We took out farmers using the word management or using the word change, and these are the sort of things they were talking about around fertiliser management. Now, obviously, I said, we don't know whether this is more or less use, so there's limitations here. But the last time I did review the RD&E priorities of all the industry and government related to fertiliser and soils, productivity and profitability and sustainability, it was all about practices to do with application, about use, about rates, about product type, around soil health and things like that. So these are the things that farmers are talking about and that's coming out. So in some ways, if we're ignoring any source or pathway to change, this is a real risk. And so the idea that there's no monopoly on change, that each source is contributing to change, I think is a significant finding. So on this topic of demand though, many of you might be saying, but is there real demand? Is it going to change? Are we in a static state, or is things going to be less or more? So in terms of what we found across all providers is that in general there's a net increase, that farmers are saying that they expect more use of their main source in the next 5 years. And so the total is there. So we're seeing 31% on average saying, no, our use is going to increase. The only one there that's net is only 5% is government. But there is some saying there's an increase and some saying that there's a decrease. So larger farms are more likely to drive the overall increase in demand. Those that were expecting to use their main source less did tend to be older, sole decision makers, or who had mainly used government services in the past. And those that were winding down operations, because we had that category, are also ones going to use less, but it was the expanding ones that were answering more. So in this regard, yes, it's all about actually how do we understand and see that demand, but definitely farmers are saying we can foresee more need and more use. Another aspect of demand might be then the skills and knowledge of the advisory sector itself, and if those sources are keeping up to date. So on the advisory side, we did look at how the advisors were engaging in professional development opportunities. And we found that half of the sample had received professional development, or training in the last 12 months. We did focus on, we covered all technical areas, but we did focus mainly on the extension side. And so regarding agricultural extension, half of the sample had said they had participated in training in this area. But you'll notice here a quite interesting detail about those doing more training tended to be the industry organisation advisors and government and others are there. But this is where some of the sole operator private firms had significantly less engagement in training. And so this issue of time and resourcing and support to that business model, this is one of the areas where some issues are coming up. So the evidence around the demand side is really quite interesting and should give us the confidence that we really need to grasp opportunities here. There's evidence of that demand. And it extends to engagement with research as well. So just briefly then, what about some constraints? What constraints are there to private sector being used or more involved? One avenue that is often considered is the importance of fee-for-service independent consultants. We can see they were the main, 32% of farmers relying on this as a main source. And so this area has been thought of and is being considered how to engage more of this group in terms of the RD&E. And so if there's regular service contacts that are privately funded, and if those advisors are connected to the RD&E system, then this is a pathway, an efficient pathway in which benefits are there. And so what we found, though, was that when we looked at attitudes towards the benefits of paying for advice, there was polarisation, I suppose, of the responses. And so definitely, we've said earlier that 32% of farmers that really relied on and had private fee-for-service consultants as a main source. And so they're the ones that are saying it's valuable, it's beneficial, I get profit, it's very worthwhile. And of course, in the red, so even those that can't see the detail, in the red, they're saying there's no value, there's no benefit, I'd never use it. But look at the middle. There is between 39 and 46% of farmers that are unsure of the benefit value, if it will help them see opportunities. And so obviously, this is an area that any individual could help clients see the value, but this is an area for potential support and encouragement by others around assisting people see more of the value. And these group can be, convinced. Another common issue is the role that, or the thinking about that perhaps the issue is that there's too much competition from non-private sector, whether that's government or industry. And so we did try to look at this issue, to what extent might this be occurring, because it would be an issue. So there's evidence that some of the groups are actually doing as they should. Again, I'm using that word in inverted commas. So we did ask the advisors, well, what type of advice are they providing? What are their main areas of advice? I'm not going to go through the table in detail, but in terms of public organisations, they are working on the environment, industry, on a range of areas, and definitely from the private sector providing specific topics. So that's sort of one issue that looks like that different advisory types are performing, I suppose, their role. So though, in terms of whether who's being involved in extension delivery, What we can see here, though, is this is where government and industry are playing a much greater role around this delivery side. And so we can see that they are more significant, quite significantly more likely to be engaged in doing those roles. So I suppose we do then have to ask about intent. Is this something that's about purposefully cutting off a private sector role here? Or is it more about groups not knowing what the interest, willingness or capability is there in the private sector, and just who is there, which could be more of the issue? So I'll speed up or jump over some things, Steve, because of the time. We did find quite a low membership of professional associations. So one of the ways could be to work more with professional associations. I won't labour on that aspect. But in terms of the question about, well, what about policy of industry or government, and is there a role there? And I suppose the most significant finding from this area of work was that nearly half of the advisors, whichever private or public they were in, said they were rarely or not involved in the agricultural research, development and extension system. Only a small proportion said they were heavily involved, between 13 and 16%, saying that they're involved with priority setting, with translating research to benefit producers, or in the design and delivery of extension. So there's a large proportion that aren't, but they say they would like to be. They would like to be more, somewhat more involved, or a lot more involved. So the advisory, so this is the extent of how much they'd like to be involved. The business owner and leads that responded to the survey said that part of the way they could be involved was through partnerships. They'd be interested to think about partnerships. And in terms of who's willing to collaborate or coordinate, most advisors said definitely with farmer-based organisations, with government, with public research, very keen there. They're unsure about this coordination and collaboration around the private sector. So this is another area around, if there's issues of trust, if there's issues of uncertainty amongst these groups in partnering, then are there ways to address this could be achieved. Now, finally, there's a lot of issues about, and actually it was Ian that mentioned it, Ian Halliday that mentioned it today about the public-private investment in this space. I just wanted to leave you some of the analysis that we did through the advisor survey by asking the advisors where was their income source from, and the relative proportion of income sources. And so this is about whether it was direct from farmers, whether it was a private company, public, industry funding, etc. And then when we bulked that up across this sample, it shows on the right-hand side there that actually, if you just look at it from this metric, there's about a 50-50 investment between private and public. Is this the right? Is this something to be maintained? These are the things that need to be sort of considered. So in summary, we can see pathways to improve adoption, stimulate the private sector and increase returns from R&D. There's demand. We need to better support the articulation of the value of advice. We need to work with all the sources. We need to consider the role of professional associations and need to consider the issues of competition. The private sector is already an active partner and already engaged, but this could be broader and deeper, such as in priority setting and translation. So in conclusion, we've aimed partly to add to knowledge of how the private sector extension is operating now. We see a pluralistic system which is internationally recognised as this diverse public-private mix, and it's often described as fragmented. I suppose what I would say is perhaps we should need to see more about strength in diversity. Here we don't have necessarily any farmer being excluded from a benefit from R&D. So it really will be about the interest and intent of the key players. So I'd just like to acknowledge the analysis support through Quantum Market Research, Nathan, Lauren, Aaron Smith, and I really look forward to the discussion today about these sort of topics. Thank you.